In this session, I want to talk about one of the most remarkable figures in the entire Nart saga corpus, and this is that of the Amazon, or Amazons. I'm sure you're all familiar with the term. It's a prominent figure, or the name of a prominent figure in Greek lore, a woman warrior or tribe of women warriors. The Greek term has been used for the name of a river, of course, in South America, the Amazon. And it's commonly used in slang or casual conversations to denote a large or strong woman. The term traditionally is thought to be a Greek word and based on a derivation meaning one without a breast or having no breasts, something like that. The explanation is that these women warriors, to allow easy firing or aiming of an arrow, would slice off the breast of a prepubescent girl so that it wouldn't be in the way when she drew her arrow. It doesn't make any sense. It's been identified as a folk etymology, as the effort of a classical writer to try to explain a foreign name. There are pictures of Amazons and a few statues of Amazons from the Greek period. They show women with both breasts. And if you're going to shoot an arrow and aim it properly, you pull the arrow up by your cheek. You don't do it down by your chest, although I have seen a few pictures of Mongol women archers doing that. If you want to hit the side of the barn, I recommend you take it up to your cheekbone and aim it that way. So it's clear that the traditional explanation is more or less nonsense. When you're reading the Circassian Nart sagas, you come upon one called a-mez-a, and it's transparently Circassian. It means the forest mother. And the tale is about a woman warrior who leads a band of women warriors. They live in the forest, and she's called Amazon, or little golden knees, because her boots and her trousers don't quite meet, and her knees are exposed, and they're suntanned, and sort of a golden brown. Robert Graves, in his collection of Greek myth, big penguin volume that you can still buy, discusses the myth of the Amazon in Greek, and says that there is some allusion in some of the Greek authors to the name being related to the word for the moon in some way, which has nothing to do with the Greek word for the moon. But curiously, if you go back to Circassian, the word for forest is a-mez-a. The word for moon is a-mez-a. Very close. If the word for moon is not stressed, and it's not stressed in Amazon, it comes out as a-mez-a. It coincides with the word for forest. So it's a natural confusion if you're a Circassian and trying to explain the name, to have the vague idea that maybe it's not just forest mother, but maybe it has something to do with the moon, which is exactly what is conveyed down in the Greek tradition. So it sounds as though in some way the Greeks are talking to the ancient Circassians and are trying to explain this name and coming up and conveying to us a bunch of ideas, or some ideas, from the Circassians, but not giving them credit and just sort of conveying it as though, well, hey, we're talking about this. They don't attribute it, and we just attribute it to the Greeks. Now, a few years ago, I had a contact from a scholar named Adrienne Mayer, who's in the classics department at Stanford. And she said, I have some inscriptions here I'd like you to look at. They're called nonsense inscriptions. No one's been able to read them for 2,500 years. They're found on Greek vases, and usually on these vases, the people depicted are wearing Scythian clothing. And I've had an episode where I discussed the Scyths, or Scyths, Scuti, and they wore trousers, they wore tunics. And the vases attest to some kind of contact, some kind of interaction, usually peaceful, between a Greek, say, a warrior, and a Scythian woman who is handing him a sword or a shield, or maybe putting a mantle on him, something like this. So it seems that there was some degree of intermarriage, perhaps, interaction of some sort, not just warfare. And The inscriptions would sometimes have nice, clear Greek on them, and they would be linked to the Greek figure, and then they had the nonsense inscription linked to the woman usually wearing a tunic and pants. Oddly enough, most of these figures are barefoot, and we know that standard Scythian dress required boots. So maybe they took their boots off when they were at home, because these are generally domestic scenes. I might explain that. All right, so the nonsense, I looked at this, and what Dr. Mayer was doing was just sending me the inscription in a kind of peculiar font. I didn't know anything about Greek vases. I never cared about Greek vases. And she was not sending me the pictures, nothing like that. And I would get these, and in one case, I translated it, and Circassian is quite elaborate. I translated it was no rare teblo, and in Circassian, believe it or not, that means that he snuck around over there, far away somewhere, and in a flat space, believe it or not, stole that from them. Okay. And you can say that all in a few syllables in Circassian. That's why it's quite a fancy language. And I was surprised at Adrian's response. She said, "Are you sure about that?" I thought about it again. I said, yeah, that's it. That's got to mean it. The only thing it can mean. I know it's a mouthful, and it seems insane, but the language works that way, and that's what it means. And she said, "You have just translated the goose vase." And I said, "What? The goose vase?" "Oh, goody, I did the goose vase. I didn't know what it was." And apparently it's a vase that has a scene on it. And it is important because it is the sole surviving bit and piece that we have from a lost comedy of the Greek writer Aristophanes. And in this comedy, an old man steals a goose from an old lady. The goose somehow ends up being killed. I guess he wants to cook it and eat it or something. And he's captured by a Scythian policeman. And he's apparently going to be tried, and he's going to be whipped for stealing the goose. So in this picture on this vase, which is in the Metropolitan Museum in Manhattan, the old man is tied up. There's a Scythian policeman about to whip him. There's an old lady sitting by with a dead goose dangling out of a basket. And he says, "I'm going to be whipped." She says, "I will bear testimony." And the policeman says, "No rare teblo," which is explaining why the man's going to be beaten or whipped for his crime, but he's explaining it in Circassian. And no one had read that in 2,500 years. So that was not an Amazon. That was a man doing that. But that seemed to open a valve. And I began looking at the ones in which there were women, sometimes with arrows and at their side, or a bow, sometimes with a sword and whatnot. And they had funny names. They had names like Hohospi, which was Abkhazian for hot shouts or wild shouting, or something like Oigma, which is Ubik for don't fail. And there was another, Hot Flanks, that was a Circassian name. There was a kind of Ossetian-like name, meaning descendant of the noble. There was another one meaning worthy of honor, worthy of armor. And these were names of Amazons in Abkhazian, Ubykh, Greek, Ossetian, or something like Ossetian. Certainly not in the exact modern forms of these languages, but plausible forms that one might expect looking back maybe 1,000 or 2,000 years. And what we did, in effect, was publish an article along with a curator from the Getty who supplied the vases, Saunders, and it was published and basically opened up an entire new phase of research in classics research, classic studies. And it bore proof of a kind of cosmopolitan character to ancient Greek culture that was not particularly palatable for some, or at least popular among most, as classicists, who wanted to see Greek civilization as a kind of self-contained, enclosed, high peak of human achievement, which it was, for sure. It was a marvelous culture. But like most cultures, it was open to a whole bunch of influences, and the genius of the Greeks was to basically make the best of these other contacts. And they did that with the Caucasus as well. And we know that they had Greek trading ports along the Black Sea coast of the Caucasus. We know about Prometheus, the Greek Titan hero, or villain from the viewpoint of the gods, the Titan that brought fire to humans. He was chained for his efforts by the gods in vengeance, chained to the mountains of the Caucasus. So the links between Greece and the Caucasus were well known. They just weren't fully appreciated. And so with the case of the Amazons, this was opened up. And it was my privilege, collaborating with Dr. Mayer, to help do this and come up with insights into one of the more enigmatic figures of Greek myth, the lady warrior. We have Theseus fighting an Amazon army that attacked Athens at an early period. We have Heracles, or Hercules, you might know him, wooing an Amazon princess, then killing her for her belt, a very crude, vicious act, but seen as a kind of brave trickery on the part of the Greeks at the time, apparently. We have Achilles mourning the death of Penthesilea, Amazon queen. We even had Alexander the Great spending a wild, I think, 11 days in bed with an Amazon queen who came down to visit him, seeking a brave and manly sire for her children, or child, and hoping to be impregnated by Alexander in his campaign as he was in Persia. So these accounts, certainly the ones with Heracles, Achilles, Theseus, they're mythical, and they could be just seen as fantasy. But the one of Alexander the Great, this almost has a historical ring to it. We begin to wonder what's going on here. Well, Dr. Mayer's brought out a book called The Amazons, and in this she documents a huge amount of this, showing very convincingly that, sure, in certain periods of history, women can be as brave and strong and warlike as men, for better or worse. One of these to which I contributed was the female pharaoh, Astashit. And again, Adrian fed it to me. And so what do you think of this name? And she said, it's known not to be an Egyptian name. No Egyptologist considers it to be an Egyptian name. I said, it's transparently Abkhazian. Excuse me. It means the one who trails behind or follows behind and kills you. So she pursues and kills. And that's apparently what Astashit was famous for on the battlefield where the Egyptians were fighting their enemies. She was very bold and would make the enemy flee and follow them and kill them as they fled. So the name makes perfect sense. It's an epithet that describes the behavior of the character. We also know that even today, people from the Caucasus have two names. One is a secret name, a family name known only to intimates, and the other is a social name that reflects some kind of action. And this would be a social name going back some 3,500 years to an ancient female pharaoh. So I think that between us, somehow we have made a case that these things, these women warriors, were real, and that they represent a kind of fulfillment of femininity that perhaps now we ourselves are only beginning to come back to by allowing women in the military. Of course, the Israelis have had women in their military for several generations, and even as recently as the Russian Revolution, there were bands of women fighters that emerged, mostly from the Caucasus, to try to defend the Tsar or overthrow the Tsar or whatnot. So they're not unknown in modern day warfare, but certainly it's something new. Certainly for the United States, for Canada, these are innovations, and we have yet to work out all the wrinkles of this. But it seems that we are going back to old things. It's sort of the origins are never very far away. Sometimes they reemerge, and the old material pops up again in the disguise or form of what we think is new material. But there's a problem with the Amazons that I want to raise and discuss. And this is the fact that in Lady Amazon, Amazon Guasha in the Circassian, she's the head of a woman band. She's not just a single woman. She's not a lady pharaoh. She's not the leader. She's not just one woman warrior. And of course, in the Greek myths, she's always, when we find a named Amazon, and a lot of them bore Greek names, probably translations of of some other foreign name. They're always the head of a band of women warriors. The only place where we really have a band of women warriors was apparently in some of the colonial wars in Dahomey. I think it was either Belgians or French, I can't remember whom, but one of the European powers was trying to conquer Dahomey, and they had women warrior bands. And they were quite brutal, and when the European power came to realize what they were dealing with, they showed them no mercy. It was quite an ugly episode in European colonialism. Now, what's a woman warrior band doing? Let's think about it for a minute. What are the women there for? Well, what are women biologically sort of designed to do is, well, reproduce the species. They're vital. We absolutely have to carry on as a species, and the women bear a very important role in this. They bear the children at great risk. Prior to modern medicine, they did so at great risk. And so it was a great honor to be a mother. You pulled it off. You did it, you managed to pull it off. One of the Spartan queens was asked what the honor of the Spartan women was, and she said, we bore heroes. We're the mother of heroes. And how is a warrior band? What's a warrior band going to do? Are they going to continue to be warriors until they're little old hags and get steamrolled by some more vigorous group, men or women? Or are they going to, at some point, stop being warrior women, settle down, and have children? Well, in the Circassian saga, they're fighting a band of warrior men. We generally consider that to be sort of what men do. They go out and fight. And so their first impression is that there's nothing really unusual about the band of warrior men. It's maybe just some kind of set of warriors that the Amazons came upon, and they fell into fighting, and the story is a kind of a tearjerker, a love story, where she has a man that she's in love with. She doesn't recognize him in the frenzy of battles. She strikes him down, and then realizes as he lies dead at her feet that this was her lover. She breaks into tears, throws herself on her sword, and lies dead beside her beloved. So it's a sad tale. But maybe something else is going on. Maybe we can interpret this not as an accident so much. Maybe in some way, this band of men is a youth band. This would go back to the work of Chris Kershaw, who examined the war band and came up with one idea, that the Indo-Europeans had a rite of passage from childhood to manhood that involved youths entering into a war band and then going off somehow to find their women. And one of the accounts in Herodotus of the Scythians mentions a Scythian band that left the steppes, left the Caucasus, went down I believe, into what is now Turkey, and had no women, and found women and settled down. So perhaps we have here some kind of very ancient mating strategy where we take the young men, the young women, we segregate them, we send them out from the original home. They survive by fighting and raiding, and eventually pair off and settle and form a conventional village of some sort and begin the process all over again. And if they don't do that, the question is, what in the world are they doing? It's not an issue of women fighting. It's the issue of the stability and duration of a war band that is apart and removed from the reproductive needs of the society. So the suggestion that, well, she has met her lover and doesn't recognize him and the tragedy unfolds, well, that's the kind of thing that strikes me as a Circassian bard, and they had women bards as well as men, and they have them. not really understanding the purpose of the story, giving into an archetype of the tragic romance, and producing a grand tearjerker that would be very, very effective on the audience. And that's not what this was about. That's not what the original story was intended to articulate. It was intended to give you a playoff, a standoff between two sides, two genders of potential mates. And if there was excess, if there was failure to recognize recognition, maybe there was a savage process in which only the bravest paired off and sort of came to a stalemate and said, okay, you're worthy. Okay. And the others died. They were killed. Somehow, survival of the fittest, kind of a brutish scenario like that. Maybe this is what the Circassians understood way back when they had these things and shared them with the Indo-Europeans. And then, excuse me, and then it's reinterpreted later when these old customs were long forgotten and long dead. So it's a very interesting tale. It's a problematic tale, and it takes us into further territory. How far off and who did this? Well, we saw some of it in the Russian Revolution. There was a bit of attestation of that. The Israelis are doing it out of necessity to staff an army with a very small population. But we get other tales. We get Wuhan from China. There's a Japanese warrior woman. Practically every identifiable society within Eurasia has some kind of female warrior that emerges in some way. Now, they seem to stand as isolated leaders, whatnot. The one that slept with Alexander was simply the queen of her people, but she was a warrior queen. Are these the relic, the tail end of a widespread process of the youth, the maidens and the youths going off to pair off in some savage encounter so that only the bravest and wildest ones survive to produce children? But it's been reinterpreted, reworked across these societies as they evolve. And as people specialize into warfare, and warfare becomes more elaborate, requires more training, more weapons and whatnot, and it comes down to a queen of some sort, or a single warrior woman who, under unusual circumstances, for some reason, decides to do what men do, and they've already forgotten about all of this. Right? Do we have any evidence of this? Yes, we do. We have skeletons. And this is largely due to Russian archaeology because they control the territory now. And we dig up bodies, and we can tell from the skeletons the gender of the original person alive. Why? Because the pelvic area, the thigh area, women have hips. Why do they have hips? To pass babies with big heads and brains. And this is a feature of the species. And you can see from the skeleton, from the structure of the pubis, the female pubis has a more open tunnel-like shape. It's wider, the hips are wider. The male, the pubis, the bones sort of point inward to constrict the area. So we can tell from the skeleton if it's a man or a woman. And we're finding in these grave mounds, in these chambers with all the weapons and sometimes a dead horse or two, sometimes some helpers, we're finding female warriors. They're in armor, they have weapons with them, and the pelvis tells us that these are women. And the helper is usually another woman, but without armor. Now, what's going on? Well, perhaps these are lesbian pairs. Maybe these were prominent women warriors and the warband, and the only one that could really afford to be buried in this very fancy grave mound with all the armor and weapons and everything else, not to be recycled, but to be sent to the other world, the land of death and all that in the afterlife. Maybe these were high-ranking commanders of the warband. And like any band of warriors, there had to be someone to lead them. There had to be someone to choose the tactics, choose the strategy, decide when to fight, not to fight. So maybe this is what we're seeing. And maybe these warbands and this kind of weird rite of passage in an effort to find suitable mates, maybe this is very widespread across the steppes of Eurasia at a remote period. Prior to the classical antiquity, we're getting an echo of it with war bands attacking Athens and so forth. And maybe just as the classical period sort of begins to really take off with Plato and Aristotle and all the stuff that we treasure from the era, the rise of Rome and all this, maybe we were at the tail end of this earlier period where we had this kind of very strange rite of passage and this mating strategy that gave rise to this very famous figure of the female warrior. And I think that today, with women's feminism, women's lib, the idea that women have the right to pursue whatever men do and all this, we're seeing a revival of an image of a woman fighter. We see that women deserve respect for their bravery, for their strength in the face of danger, and their willingness to defend their homeland, their country, this sort of thing. But I think in some ways this is not what this was originally. I think this was something much different, and I think perhaps in some ways something quite savage by our standards, something that involved a very brutish way of selecting a mate, but ensured very brave, strong, and warlike children. So I'm not at all sure that we're seeing new Amazons. I think the Amazons in some ways are still perhaps more enigmatic and complex than anything we're seeing now. And perhaps the closest thing would have been some of those Caucasian bands of ladies that went up to fight for the Tsar. I have seen one Circassian woman go into something like a berserker rage. I was able to stop her. She was getting very mad. And maybe she would have been a good Amazon 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. And perhaps they practice a battle frenzy, berserker-like frenzy, as well as the men. Because this woman did just what a man did that I thought was going into something like a berserker frenzy, a Circassian man. Eyes rolling back in the head, going rigid, beginning to tremble, turning colors, blue, purple, white, getting ready for ferocious fighting. And apparently, from the Russian accounts of the battles in the Caucasus, these people did this all the time. And they preserved berserker frenzy as a battle strategy on the battlefield long after it was lost among the Norse or anybody else in the Indo-European descendant world. So the Amazons now, I think we can argue safely on the basis of Dr. Mayer's work and some of the material in the Nart sagas that they were real. They were not a myth, and that they were a feature of very remote classical period. They were fading out as the classical period began to become an historical, documented era. But exactly what they were, exactly how far they extended, and precisely what alternatives they may have had as mating strategies. Perhaps they were confined to a warrior caste or something like this. This is something yet to be deciphered, yet to be figured out. We know that the Indians, up until the British domination, had a caste system. There are hints of a caste system in some of the other Indo-European peoples. This is what the late comparative mythologist and polyglot Georges de Mézil examined. He called it the three functions: a kind of priestly function, a warrior function, and then a kind of economic one. Circassians said something like this. Abkhazians and Uzbeks said something like this. Ossetians have hints of it. And maybe in Rome we have some hint because the marriage of the priests is very different from the marriage ceremony among warrior people, warrior groups within Rome, early Rome. And what happens, marriage among Roman soldiers and women, simply they live together. They somehow match up and they live together, and they can weaken any obligations by the woman breaking off, not staying 3 nights, staying 3 nights away from her husband. It's called usus rompare, breaking the habit. And then they can renew their vows or renew their bond again by simply renewing their living together. It sounds something like what might transpire between two people who meet off in the battlefield, decide they're well matched. Oh, they're just going to go. That's the ceremony right there. It was the most vivid ceremony of all. Attempts to slaughter each other. And if it doesn't succeed, well, then hate, animosity flips over into love. And we know that. We know the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And hate and love stand in a kind of peculiar polarity. So the antagonism and the passion of bonding together, they're sort of two sides of one kind of spectrum here. So perhaps in Rome, too, we see with this kind of casual pairing off of man and a soldier and woman, something going back to the pairing off that might have occurred on the battlefield between war bands of men and war bands of women. And Chris Kershaw, in her monograph on the Odin, the One-Eyed God, talks about war bands of youth, and she emphasizes that certainly for the men, there were certain groups that had these bachelor bands of warriors, and their goal was to find women. And my guess is that even at an earlier stage, for certain groups, there were maiden bands of warriors, and that this was a way of facing off and perpetuating the tribe.